We don't have a board or anything to write on.
No.
All right, it's 1:30, so we'll get started. And welcome to Challenging Contingency in Higher Education. It's a book panel on this book here. Just recently released, Contingent Faculty in the Remaking of Higher Education, a Labor History, and it's published by the University of Illinois Press in early 2024. So thanks for being here for this session. I'm Eric Fure-Slocum. I'm the moderator for the panel and one of the co-editors of this book. I'm a U.S. labor historian, an urban historian, and taught for 25 years at St. Olaf College in Minnesota and taught as a contingent faculty member that whole time. We'll begin with just a few brief introductions, followed by 10-minute presentations by 4 of the book's contributors. These are 4 of the 25 contributors to this book. I guess I make up the 5th. Then we look forward to questions and discussion after that. So please hold questions until all the presenters are done, but take notes so that we can have a robust conversation. And just to note that this session is being videotaped as well. If you have phones or any other devices that make noises, turn those off at this time. Make sure I do that myself. The book, Contingent Faculty in the Remaking of Higher Education, is a book that I co-edited with Claire Goldstein, and it begins with a grim statistic that unfortunately is now not very surprising. 75% of the faculty at 2- and 4-year colleges are contingent faculty, and that's a reversal from the 1970s when 3/4 of the faculty were tenure stream faculty. And these precarious workers, ranging from part-time course-by-course adjuncts to full-time contingent faculty to graduate student workers, they share the worries and concerns that plague so many others in today's gig economy. These include little to no job security, few, if any, health care benefits, insufficient retirement savings, and diminished professional status. But contingent faculty have responded to this precarity with a range of different actions, raising their voices to influence departmental or campus-wide practices, steering professional organizations to recognize their plight, and organizing faculty unions to begin to bargain collectively at a time when union density is declining in so many other sectors. And in these various ways, right, contingent faculty are challenging contingency in higher education so that academic workers get a fair shake, so that students get the educations they deserve and they need, and certainly so that colleges and universities can begin to reclaim their vital public purpose. The book, and just to say briefly, it examines academic work, contingent academic work, through the lens of labor history, between sets of bookend essays that really help to contextualize the larger set of issues, and then with personal accounts threaded throughout. The book narrates this history in 3 parts. 1, first, the political economy and structure of contingent faculty, answering the question of the making of the contingent faculty majority. 2nd, looking at contingent faculties and adjuncts' day-to-day experiences and their struggles in the academic workplace. Right? In a sense, the shop floor experience, but as well as looking at the ways in which it has an impact outside the workplace as well, and thinking about social reproduction too. And then 3rd, contingent faculty advocacy work, organizing and collective bargaining. How are contingent faculty and allies fighting for better working conditions and better learning conditions? And we hope that this volume really can contribute to the work that faculty unions are doing to remake higher education. So in this session, we have 4 presenters, and it's a panel of scholar activists. And I really want to emphasize that term. These are 4 exemplary scholar activists. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be presenting. Start with Gary Rhoades. Gary's a professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Practice and at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. His research addresses restructuring of academic institutions, occupations, and professions, as in the books Managed Professionals, Unionized Faculty, and Restructuring Academic Labor, and Academic Capitalism and the New Economy. A former AAUP General Secretary and New Faculty Majority Foundation board member, Gary works with various national and local unions and is a member of the CWA Local 7065 at the University of Arizona. Gary also has a new book on its way to publication titled Organizing Professionals, Academic Employees Negotiate a New Academy. Gwendolyn Alker is an associate arts professor in the Department of Drama at the Tisch School of Arts, New York University, where she specializes in gender and performance and Latinx theater. As a scholar, dramaturg, editor, and teacher, she has taught in the MFA program at Naropa University, been a visiting guest artist at Princeton University, and has recently worked on shows at the Public Theater and La Mama Experimental Theater Club. As a labor activist, she helped unionize NYU's adjunct faculty in the early 2000s, and more recently worked on the very successful UAW CFU drive, organizing full-time contingent faculty at NYU. Yeah, I was going to call for applause. And finally, now that the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike is over, she encourages everyone who is in New York City for this conference to go and see some theater. Joe Barry is a retired contingent labor educator for unions and colleges and been active in the AFT. This is a long list. The AFT, AAUP, NEA, SEIU, IWW, and other unions as member, staffer, elected officer, and educator. He's the author of Reclaiming the Ivory Tower, Organizing Adjuncts to Change Higher Education, and co-author with Helena Worthen of Power Despite Precarity, Strategy.
Strategy.
That could have been a title.
Good thing I'm almost done. Strategy. Now I'm in a corner. You know what I mean, for the continued faculty movement in higher education. And Helena Worthen is here as well as co-author. Recently, he taught labor studies in Vietnam and is currently active in Higher Ed Labor United, the coalition of contingent academic labor, and his own union, AFT 2121 at City College of San Francisco. And finally, Ann McLeer is the Director of Higher Education and Strategic Planning, that word thrown at me again, at SEIU Local 500 in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, where she oversees higher education work of the union. She earned her Ph.D. in Human Sciences from George Washington University in 2002 and has taught in American Studies, English, and Women's Studies as a part-time faculty member at George Washington University. She also served on the board of the New Faculty Majority Foundation. So again, I welcome this panel of very distinguished scholar activists. So just a few things on logistics. They're going to each take 10 minutes to present. I'll try to keep that time in check. And also the PowerPoint over here, I apologize to those of you who are out of line of sight for the PowerPoint. Oh, there's one over there. Okay, excellent. And please hold questions until the end, as I mentioned earlier, and then we'll have hopefully a good session of questions and answers. So, turn it over to Gary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. And I want to start out first by thanking Eric and Claire for the opportunity to be part of this volume, which is really an impressive volume. It's a privilege to be part of this and to be part of this panel. It's a superb piece of work, both academically, so I'm glad you introduced folks as scholar activists, Eric, because there is a lot of really good academic work in here, and it is superb as a resource, because the panel, like the book, is filled with the contributions of a lot of ass kickers in terms of organizing. And I say that with a lot of affection and regard, including the people on this panel, from whom I have learned just over the years a tremendous, tremendous amount about a whole range of issues, but particularly about issues of organizing and negotiating contingent employees in higher education, and particularly in this case, contingent faculty. I've drawn on this volume, as I mentioned to folks yesterday when we got together, for this book manuscript that I have into Rutgers. It has couple chapters on contingent faculty. It is just really, so even those who I didn't know, like Gwendolyn, I was drawing on your stuff for that book because it's just a great contribution and fabulous that you organized it, NYU folks. My chapter traces sort of the growth of contingent academic employment more broadly. I deal a little bit with graduate employees and postdocs for reasons that will become evident in a few minutes, which also have separate chapter in my book, but here I concentrate on the contingent faculty because there's this growth of contingent employment as in the broader economy in a range of sectors of our economy. And what we see is an amplification of this growing contingency along the contours of what Eric talked about, a rise of part-time non-tenure track faculty to be close to half the faculty workforce, and then another 20% or so of full-time non-tenure track faculty who emerged somewhat later and now account for, as I said, about 25% of that workforce, not even to mention grad employees and postdoc as the core academic workforce in higher education. And this amplification of contingent employment comes with deterioration of working conditions. This is not an accident. This is capitalism. And this is academic capitalism, sort of our version of capitalism, which is we're bad at it. We're good at the exploitation of employees and of students. We're bad at actually making money. So when Sheila and I wrote that book, we kind of struggled with the title, Academic Capitalism. It sounds like we're good capitalists, as if there are good capitalists. But we're not even good at capitalism as institutions, as we all live. What I do in this chapter is to trace that growth and to recognize that part of that growth is a growing critique, an articulation of a critique of corporatization in the academy. Not just, oh, these are bad working conditions, what a shame. I guess people took their eye off the ball and didn't realize what was going on. But rather, this is what the game is for management. And so I trace that growth over time for contingent faculty, and I also trace what the demographics of those faculty are. And I'm glad Eric mentioned there's 25 contributors to the volume. So they're more demographically diverse than the wonderfully diverse and terrific people on this panel. So there's African American, Latinx folks, Asian American, and that's important because that's the nature of the contingent academic workforce. If you identify as a woman, you are most likely to, and are a faculty member, you are most likely to be contingent. That doesn't mean most contingent faculty identify as women, but it means if you are a woman and the same for people of color. If you're a person of color and you're a faculty member, you're most likely to be contingent. So it isn't just capitalism. Like it's just a little confluence. If it was me and I saw that the deteriorating working conditions and the contingent employment and the lack of benefits and the crappy pay just happened to coincide with the rise of a workforce in which there were larger representations of women and people of color, I'd say, well, I wonder if that's a coincidence. Probably I wouldn't think it was a coincidence. Just like what happens with our students. Decreased investment in public higher education as the students we're teaching increases in its diversity. So that's, I think, an important part of the story. And so I'll come to my basic points in this chapter, which is that contingent faculty have not just risen in number. They've been at the center and the vanguard of organizing in the 2020s in particular. And they've had an impact on the strategies, on the practices, on where people are organizing, what the configuration of units are, the people or the internationals or nationals that they're unionizing with. And so you can see this in new advocacy organizations dating back a couple decades, whether that's the California Part-Time Faculty Association or COCAL, Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor. A little more recently, New Faculty Majority, of which many of the board members are here, and I felt really privileged to be part of that. Sort of a takeover of some major locals nationally. from the California Faculty Association to much more aggressive treatment, although it's never enough, by the Professional Staff Congress, to creating caucuses within the major academic unions, which then leveraged change within those unions in terms of addressing contingency. But most importantly, new bargaining units with new affiliates. SEIU is dominated in this regard, but there are others as well. And organizing in settings and with strategies like a metro strategy that in some way I think Ann will probably talk about and Joe has written about, which is quite remarkable given that this organizing is taking place against, what's my time?
Well, it's 7.
Fabulous, my God.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
wrong? I'm not gonna run over. So when Ann and her colleagues organized at GW, the employer was the second biggest landowner in the District of Columbia. This is not a small adversary. When you organized at NYU most recently, I believe they're maybe the third largest landowner in New York City, probably Columbia, NYU, and
Catholic Church.
and the Catholic Church. Like, those are powerful entities, right? And so what's amazing is not just the level of organizing, but the level of success against the level of resistance. Even though you wrote wonderfully in this book about it, I think early on they didn't take it seriously enough. They didn't think it was going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Also with new strategies that are increasingly like wall-to-wall strategies. So I can come up with multiple examples, but when I started at the AAUP, we started a couple of campaigns which were distinctively multi-employee centered in a way that hadn't been quite as common before, but has become increasingly common sense. And the two examples I'd give would be UIC, where the employer resisted.
Say where that is.
University of Illinois, Chicago. Thanks, Joe. Not everybody knows the acronym.
It's a national.
Yeah. And the other one was the University of Oregon, which includes full-time, part-time, postdocs, not grad students, because they have one of the oldest grad unions in the country, unbeknownst to our keynote speaker. So that influence of contingent faculty on not only creating new part-time only units, which have just had an incredible effect on challenging this system as being problematic both for employees and for students. So the genius mantra of faculty's working conditions are students' learning conditions cuts to the heart of critiquing capitalism, which always seeks to divide and pit employees against consumers, customers, students, whatever you pick, whatever the sector. And this mantra, which is real, gets over it, and contingent faculty have been really effective in negotiating a range of quality working condition issues. So the final thing I'll say is to the grad employees and the postdocs, which we've heard about a couple of times already in this conference, both in the keynote, but also in the session on sexual discrimination, sexual harassment. Systematically, every campaign that I know of in those categories of employees intersects workplace justice with social justice. Mm-hmm. It's about sexual harassment and independent external arbitration. It's about racial discrimination. It's about treatment of international employees. So in that session on sexual harassment, the UAW postdoc employee Cora talked about, most of us are international. We can be deported. Management comes at us in that way with campaigns. It says, I don't know, you join a union and you go on strike, you could be deported because you're not working. So this intersection of workplace and social justice in ways that in the board meeting yesterday, Charles Toombs said, he's the faculty leader of California Faculty Association, the president, said these are bread and butter issues. Because someone was saying, well, these are new issues on the margins. And no, these are bread and butter issues for what is an increasingly diverse workforce. And I think contingent faculty move the ball in various really important ways. I think other contingent employees, academic employees, grad employees, and postdocs have taken it even further in ways that really represent what our future is, what our present is as a country, but what our future could and should be. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. So
Thanks.
we need the
And I'll-
slides. All right. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me with or without the mic? Okay. I'm a theater person, so we have to like engage, make sure everybody's listening. That's what we do in the theater. Anyway. All right. So, I'm already on that slide. Wow. I thought it was back a slide. I go back one slide because that's the title of my chapter. Yes,
Yes,
there's
sorry.
my chapter. Okay. So, all right. So I am here because I wrote this chapter in the book. I'm going to sort of assume that you could read it. So I'm not thinking that my time is best spent to just rehash the chapter, although I do a little bit of that. But I do want to encourage you to read it because I'm proud of it and I think it's fabulous. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to introduce myself for a moment just because I'm a little bit the outsider here. I thought I'd be the only woman with bluish green hair, but I apparently am wrong. And that my co-panelist also has bluish green hair. So
We didn't get the memo.
we didn't plan that, it just happened. But I will say that I do have a little bit of imposter syndrome here, but as a theater person, we're really good at pretending to be people that we're not and making you believe our truths, which may or may not be true. So that's all works out for me here. But really, I'm speaking to you as a scholar of gender and performance and also as a labor organizer. And in particular, I'm coming from New York University's Department of Drama, which is actually the biggest theater department in the world, unless there's something in China I'm not aware of. And I want to put that in terms that you folks as labor activists can understand. NYU Drama is one of the most expensive private universities, producing the largest amount of workers who are the least likely to earn a living using the skills that they have received in our program. So we're, from a labor perspective, at the bottom of the barrel that we train all the people who never get jobs. So just want to put that out there. Anyway, my main, discussion on my chapter will be about how to apply a feminist lens to the contingency crisis or the current situation with contingent faculty. And my own training really comes from an interdisciplinary background. My Ph.D. is in performance studies, also from Tisch School of the Arts, which is really a kind of almost like a cultural anthropology degree with a slant on theater and performance. I would therefore say that I'm also interested in intersectional issues, and I'd like to kind of define that term as a feminist scholar, because I always feel I have to do that with my students and the people who are not in feminist theory, that when we say intersectional, what we should be talking about is Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of the particular legal challenges that Black women face in this country as being multi-axes, and therefore unable to account for their own complexity of lived experience. However, I will say that in our society now, the word intersectional is used to refer to any intersecting of race, gender, class, ability, etc. And I will sometimes use the term in that manner, noting that that is not the way that Crenshaw intended it. I will also note that my primary lens was gender, not race, but I also want to say, like Gary said, I feel like I'm a little bit like the weird outsider, but I'm also like a total white chick, so it's not actually that I'm all that different, and I don't want to be disrespectful to my elders because I will soon be you as a white person, but it would be great if we had more kind of actual voices from people of color and different gender identities and that type of thing on this panel. So I'm just going to say that out loud. I also want to talk a little about my most recent experiences as an organizer, and I'm approaching this presentation with those two things in mind. All right, slide 3, please. So a few things on my chapter. As I noted before, my main interest was to think about how a feminist lens could bolster a deeper understanding towards collective action and towards kind of practical steps on the ground. Slide, please. I think one of the main things that I felt, both in my own personal experience as a longtime contingent faculty member, was that these questions of contingent labor and what I would call women's work are really interstitial. that you can't really think through kind of the theoretical or historical issues of contingent labor without thinking about how women are treated in all types of labor environments. So slide, please. So the first kind of sub-argument on that question is what I'm going to call the feminization of labor. So I think that for me, it's kind of more of a theoretical argument that's not really based in data. I'm a humanities person, so data's like, sometimes we dabble and sometimes we don't. But it's to think about how when something is labeled as women's work, it is therefore able to be devalued. And I'm coming, of course, from a Research One university in a humanities context, not in a social science or hard science context. And what I've noticed within the kind of more the humanities realm is that work that can be done increasingly by contingent faculty are what we might think of in the academy as women's work, which is basically to say taking care of the children and doing the low-level service work. Whereas that opens up for the more prestigious activities of writing books, thinking great thoughts, and this very Cartesian dualism of mind-body, of being a gendered one. And in some ways that becomes an argument within the faculty themselves, whether they're aware of it or not, to say, well, those people are just teaching big intro classes with a lot of students at the first year level. Therefore, they're not that important. They can be staffed by contingent labor. But that's something about devaluing the nature of the labor itself from a feminist perspective. I think we need to be aware of the fact that these two things go hand in hand. All right. The other thing I would say, and the next slide can support this, is to say that when we're talking about what I mean by feminization of labor, I'm not just talking about cis women doing that labor. I'm saying that people of all sorts of, gender identities could be doing that labor, but that is labor that is typically associated with kind of feminine caretaking or women's work. All right. The other thing, and Gary also mentioned this, I don't think I need to spend too much time on it, but the next thing I think we need to think about is that this adjunctification, particularly of the university, is being an interstitial phenomenon with the entrance of women and people of color into institutions of higher education. This was something that really happened at a certain time in the 1970s, and I don't think it's an accident that those two things happened at the same time. Slide, please. I think one thing we can think about that I talk about in my chapter is how tenure as a system that kind of reached its height after World War II with the massive funding and influx of students on the GI Bill, those are based around mostly white male bodies, including my own father's, who's very much of that generation, did very successful things in his career. But that those clocks in terms of when you're hired, when you go up for tenure, when you go through mechanisms of promotion and review, those are very much based upon the hidden labor of the woman at home who's raising the children, who's allowing them to have their time to get their first book out, and that all those structures were actually built onto the white man's body in these very particular ways that we don't always think about, that perhaps tenure is not always the right goal if we're trying to think about how to shift labor practices in academia, because those themselves are flawed from a feminist perspective. Slide. The other thing I would say that a feminist lens has taught me to think about is this question of collective action. I would say that this for me is really something I've been thinking about a lot recently, particularly with my own students and through this question of intersectionality. I recommend a show, because I had to get a pitch in for a show, which is that you all go see The Ally at the Public Theater, which is a fabulous show. See, you're nodding your head, that's yay. So this show makes us think about how the newer generation, and certainly I see this manifest in my own students, is that they don't believe that any one political activist front can be separated from any other. So for example, if you're a student who's doing labor organizing, you also have to be protesting Gaza, and you also have to be protesting Black Lives Matter, and that all those things are intrinsically bound up into a larger move towards collective action. I think that that's, for my students' generation, that's something they have to figure out in a way, and I think it emerges again out of some of the failures of the second wave feminist movement, where it was seen not to be inclusive, particularly of people with different sexualities, different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, that they felt that they weren't included in this overarching umbrella of second wave feminism. That's a complicated conversation, but I think we're seeing that kind of focus on collective organizing as partly as a result of that. I think it's in this tricky moment where perhaps it's gone a little bit too far, which we can talk about more in the Q&A if we need to. All right, and then finally, my last slide. I do want to also bring to the fore what I've been doing recently, since I actually finished my chapter, which has been organizing CFU, which is the faculty union that we just unionized on February 28th for the full-time contract faculty at NYU. This was a long, hard-fought campaign. We started organizing in 2017 or thereabouts. I have one of the organizers here, so props to her. She's done a lot more work than I have on this campaign. But we had a good turnout. We had 67% of the faculty voted, and the vote was overwhelmingly in support of unionization, 553 yes and 72 no. This is now the largest full-time union vote. The largest full-time faculty union vote to date at a private university. We have a bargaining unit of about 1,000. Is that right? Yeah, she's nodding her head. And I would also say that NYU is now overwhelmingly a union campus, and that our only faculty who are not unionized are like a kind of weird research class, and then the tenure track folks. Everybody else is unionized, so woohoo. Finally, I will end on the fact that where I was sitting in that particular campaign was as a pro-union person within Tisch. Tisch was a very weird situation that people on that campaign know was like known for being anti-union, which was very weird because most of our faculty are unionized with other locals, like SAG-AFTRA, DGA, IATSE, cinematographers, I don't know what they're called. Like, we all are unionized, but there was this weird anti-union build in my own school, and I was actually one of the very few faculty members who were, vocal and out as being pro-union and actually knocking doors towards the end of the campaign. I don't know I have many ideas on why that was, and I'm happy to discuss that further in the Q&A, but suffice it to say it was a very challenging campaign. And the people at Tisch had a particularly hard uphill battle. So I'm very pleased that that came through, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I will try and follow the excellent examples of my two predecessors and use less than my full time. I like your pattern too of some summary of what we said in the chapter, but also some casting forward and some other ideas specifically for this group and for this talk. Because the book, because it had a long gestation period, the chapters were written a long time ago. And things have happened, thank God, right? Higher education labor is more the center of discussion in the United States now than it ever has been. And many of us on this panel, and I'm sure many of you in the room, have gotten calls from reporters and other people talking about, interested in what you're doing, who were never interested. 5 years ago, you would have never gotten those calls. And that's extremely gratifying, especially if one puts out a book about that time, as this book or the book Helen and I wrote 2 years ago. So what we tried to do in this chapter with my co-author Helen Worthen, and we call this the remaking of higher education, a fifth transition. And from the point of view of the workforce, we tried to periodize the history of higher education in the United States from the point of view of the workforce. We think this is if not unique, an unusual way to look at the history. And that there have been 4 previous transitions, and we are now in the midst of a 5th transition, which we can help shape if we get ourselves together. The first, late 19th, early 20th century, was standardization, largely under the rubric of the Carnegie Commission and Commission on Teaching, and it gave birth to a national faculty, the national searches, TIA, CREF, the credit system, the 15-hour system, all that stuff. And it also took place K-12. And that, along with, the second period we would describe is expansion, which took place especially after World War II, as was mentioned. Tremendous expansion, mostly still white guys because of who had access to the GI Bill, and you could get paid for and stipend, get tuition paid and a stipend for going to any university that you could get into. Well, that was the key thing, right? Women were excluded from a lot of places. They were excluded from a lot of programs. Black people were excluded from a lot of programs and a lot of schools. The third period that we'd look at would be what we call the movement, starting in the late 50s, going through the 60s and into the 70s, where the children of that previous generation were coming to school and were making demands. We're making demands of both expansion of access and demands of expansion and change of curriculum, of the content, demands of especially because expansion had included expansion in the sector, so that like a community college opening every week for a while in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s, and which is now the majority of higher education. Drives me crazy when people talk about higher education. They keep using the word university, university, university. That was all our keynote speakers said. For those of us working in the less prestigious parts of higher education than R1 universities, it's like fingernails on the blackboard. And the movement was not successful in fundamentally changing higher education as a system or the society, though many of us did our best with lots of mistakes. But we did make some substantial changes. And partly as a result of the movement, you had a neoliberal contraction. The period starting in the 70s, starting most prominently in California, led by the casualization of the faculty, and then sweeping across the country from west to east. All of these were the result of conflicting forces making new demands on higher education, and then a new synthesis coming forward. If that sounds like basic dialectics, I think it is. So the same goes for the current transition, which we can be a part of. The neoliberal contraction and casualization started in the 70s, didn't originate in higher ed, of course, nor did the austerity program. Thank you. But in terms of impact on the workforce, who was hired, how they were hired, who was in the labor pool, how they were managed, paid, protected, or not, regulated, et cetera, it hit higher ed earlier than a lot of places and more severely. In one generation, higher ed, as was mentioned, went from mostly full-time, tenured, secure, tenure-track, living wage, benefited jobs to not that. In one generation, unfortunately, it was my generation. So I'm an old guy, 75. There was no smoking gun. There was no Powell memo for this. These were decisions that were made by middle and lower level administrators meeting problems that they faced. It was a solution. The problems that they faced that casualization helped them answer were, one, relatively declining funding, both public sector appropriations and private sector donations because of the profit crisis, right, in the privates. Changes in the student body as more and more students were part-time, older, women coming out of the women's movement, getting out of bad marriages, people losing jobs, needing retraining, vets, etc. A just-in-time student body, and so they needed a flexible faculty, more flexible than before. Also, the rise of faculty unionism was obviously a problem for them, and setting up a casualized two-tier system was a great way to frustrate unionization. This wasn't in front of their minds at the beginning, but it came to be more and more important. And the diversification of the faculty hiring pool, which has already been mentioned a couple of times, that as it wasn't upper-class white men overwhelmingly, then the job got degraded too, just as happened with clerical work. When it was white guys, that was the way to management. When the typewriter was invented and it became mostly white, and then later more people, women of color jobs, the job got degraded. So this labor history book appears just as the contingent faculty movement is rising. And we would argue that the contributions of the book are, useful lessons, we hope, wider public knowledge of the situation of folks teaching society's next generation, our social reproduction function, contingent faculty how we fit into the political economy of the US today, and which most of us, even doing the work, people don't necessarily know that, and how the movement fits into labor history. This is a labor history series this book is part of, and some ideas, most importantly, of how higher ed should be, what the fifth transition should look like. So, starting with the negative, what are the dangers? Well, if we don't act collectively to shape it, we're going to see the pillaging of the value of higher ed, research, social mobility, social reproduction, creation of knowledge through the exercise of academic freedom, stabilizing role in a changing world. All those things are pillaged. Permanent shrinkage of access and of the whole enterprise. Vocational only focus for the vast majority, the only people that will get a general critical education will be the rich, and loss of public sector education in general for democratic citizenship, and higher ed becomes a private commodity. So what are our hopes? We hope for a democratic, transparent, responsible, adequately funded public higher education system that can serve the mostly working class population of the United States, supported by a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast, bottom-up coalition of workers in labor unions and organizations. That's our pitch for Higher Ed Labor United. Urge you to go to higheredlaborunited.org and check it out, which started in 2020 and is focusing more and more of its attention on contingency. The current struggle is about the bundle of anti-tenure laws and practices and anti-DEI, challenges to identity, all of that. It's often framed as a fight over academic freedom, but it's really unionization is the fight. And academic freedom and free speech on the job. I argue that AAUP's perspective is too narrow, that all workers, and especially professional workers, need free speech on the job, and the society needs us to have free speech on the job. You don't want your lawyer looking over the shoulder and not telling you the truth as he sees it, as she sees it. Likewise, your healthcare provider. Likewise, the guy that puts your car together. You want him to be able to stop the line when a dangerous, malfunctioning part is being inserted into your car. We as a society need free speech on and about the job, and not just a special privilege for us as academics. That's my rap on academic freedom and its relationship to free speech. And the only way to have enough power to win these things is a higher ed labor movement that includes everybody, wall to wall, coast to coast. And I would like to say, if I can steal another 30 seconds, to say out loud 3 websites that I encourage people to go to. And if one of you would write them on the blackboard, since it's not here, but I can write it, I would really appreciate that. There and there. The first one is contingentworld.com, and that's the website of the upcoming Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor.
It's org.
Pardon me?
It's .org on that one.
.org. I'm sorry, you're right. .org. That's the website of the Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor, which is having its biannual conference in Quebec in August, and I strongly encourage people to check that out and go. The second is higheredlaborunited.org, which I've mentioned before, is a coalition mostly of local unions, and it will have its founding convention May 17th to 19th in Rutgers and online.
Say it.
higheredlaborunited.org. Thank you very much. And the last one is, many of you are familiar with the organization Labor Notes. I won't tell people to go to the conference because it's sold out. 4,500 people, wonderful. But they have a higher ed labor discussion every week led by a wonderful facilitator named Barbara Mandaloni. I encourage people to get on that. Send her an email at barbara@labornotes.org and get on that discussion, which is a discussion of both the issues that confront us in higher ed labor vis-a-vis the boss and the issues that confront us within the unions themselves that often don't represent us all adequately and definitely aren't talking to each other on the level that they should, which is why Higher Ed Labor United is so important.
What was the ending?
Org.
They're all orgs?
All over.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for letting me go over.
So Claire asked me to write an essay in this book about the organizing we've been doing in the DC area for the last while. And I'm like, oh, you want me to write 8 pages about the last 20 years of my life? Okay, I'll do it. But not only did I write 8 pages about the last 20 years of my life, I made 1 slide about the last 20 years of my life. So these are the institutions of higher ed, colleges, some community colleges, some very prestigious universities, Georgetown, Howard, that we at Local 500 represent adjunct faculty, part-time faculty, contingent full-time, graduate student workers and staff. So this represents 20 years of organizing in a metro area, 11 institutions, 15 bargaining units, 14 contracts. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. That's the effort we've been making to do a metro strategy in the DC, Maryland area. You can move on to the next slide. So I agree with these guys, you should read the book. But I went back a little bit in my head about how do we even organize? The first group was George Washington University. How do we even organize adjuncts? And I don't know if any of you read Benedict Anderson's book, Imagine Communities. That concept seemed perfect when I was thinking back on what we did and how we did it, because you're talking about, 1,300 people who don't know each other, right? So Imagine Community is exactly what you imagine it is, right? Where a group of people, it's a socially constructed community where a group of people think of themselves in a common way in order to achieve something. Right? And it can be constructed by someone trying to achieve something to manipulate you, or vice versa, right? But clearly what we were doing was trying to create an imagined community. And I think that back then still is true today, because most workplaces, everybody doesn't know each other, right? So this slide shows you that, for organizing, you have to have a community of interest, right? And that's the legal framing, but unless that's 20 people that know each other in one workplace, you are talking about that community being imagined. Then the question of, so Anderson has this quote about all Americans, you don't know them all, but you're confident in their steady, anonymous, simultaneous activity, and that's what it means to be a nation that's, say, Americans, right? You go on to the next slide, thank you. So taking this, we're like, all right, what was it that we had to do to create an imagined community of an adjunct faculty, part-time faculty union, right? Well, a number of things had to be turned on their heads, and I also think that this is still true, Joe. So do you mind if I stand up to you? So we started off saying we're academic labor, not professors, not whatever. Because one of the biggest barriers to us organizing adjuncts back in the day was the sense of prestige. Even the universities used to say, oh, well, you can just teach here for nothing and you put it on your CV, right? So these are sort of contradictions that we used to frame the adjunct community, right? So your academic labor, this is work, this is not, and we had to get rid of academic prestige, right? Exploitation, not status, right? The situation you're in is structural, not personal. The answer is collective, not individual, right? But also the problem is collective, not individual, right? That I didn't get that tenure track job wasn't because I didn't write a good dissertation, wasn't because I was discriminated against. It was because 75% of the jobs are contingent, right? And then this is Helena's. I love this. We also wanted to, the wringing of the hands and of the poor adjuncts, the poor us, was not what we wanted. It was fight, not flight. Okay. Shit, okay. So, 20 years later, did we confront contingency? Well, yes. We had double pay, more than double pay in many of these places. Job security, we reduced the marginalization, we professionalized the casualized. Adjuncts and contingent full-timer and grad students claimed a voice, right? But, as we heard earlier, that proportion, the 75 to 25, has not changed much, right, if at all, or it's getting worse, right? Another example of this, at George Washington University, I don't know, like 15 years ago, the proportion of classes taught by contingent faculty was 48%. It's still 48%, right? So we're making progress, but as far as I'm concerned, not fast enough. You go on to the next slide. All right, so I use this opportunity to talk a little bit about Joe and Helena. If nobody minds. So this book has lots of essays in it about labor history, but this book itself is also a piece of labor history, right? So I met you, 2005, just after we started organizing, we read this book, Reclaiming the Ivory Tower, took many of the ideas of this book. And Joe and Helena have been organizing since the 70s, raising issues about contingent faculty. I feel like this was the baton that was handed over to me, and the work I've done for the last 21 years has been, they've been inspiring, they supported me, they knocked the imposter syndrome out of my head. So I wanted to thank them for that.
Slept in your basement.
Slept in my basement, we washed my dishes, it was good for arthritis. Helena pulled up my weeds. So there's a movement in here, right? It's not just, it's not just academic, all right, which is a good segue into my next slide, right? So today on campus organizing, I started this slide as like just making a list of all the people we're organizing, right? And I put academic workers up here for the faculty, but then I realized, no, all these workers are academic workers, right?
That's right.
They are the workers of the academy, right?
That's right.
So this is what we're doing now. This is a picture of our strike, American University, where we were organizing staff and they went on strike in 2021 or 2. And the students walked out of the convocation. It was super powerful.
During COVID.
Yes, it was during
You
COVID,
gotta
right?
say that, that's important.
This list includes, right down here, we've got wageless workers. We're looking at organizing residence assistants who don't have any wages. They get us housing stipend. How we'll do it? I don't know how we'll do it, but we will. So, yeah, this is all the groups being organized. About 8 minutes, not quite. I think you can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so the last part of my chapter talks a little bit about how we evolved, how the Metro strategy evolved. So I think we did a good job with the outside part of it. So Joe's book talks about the inside-outside strategy, right? Which is literally every little piece, right? I think we did a good job with the outside strategy, right? We've unionized, we've worked with community allies, students, the whole thing. More of that needs to happen. But we let the inside drop a little bit, right? Because there's only so much energy you have. So I do think that these two need to come back together. Because is that the second last? That's the second last slide, right? Yes. So if you read my chapter, the very last page is a sort of a plea or a plan, whatever. What we need on campuses in any city where there's a density in the market of contingent faculty organized, we need all the workers on campus to be organized, and all the groups, these guys here, the inside groups, the progressive student groups, everybody to be together in a formal labor coalitions. And of those there's a formal labor coalition in each of our universities in our market, right? Hate using that word. And then maybe an umbrella organization that mirrors the employer organization that they have in the Washington, D.C. area to really crack this contingency thing. And there's sort of two keys now, which is the staff organizing that's going on and the students. The student activism is a thing that links it all together. And that's the end of my talk about the book. But because I wanted to honor Joe and Helena today, I want to read a poem for them. So this is a famous poem, a translation of a poem by Antonio Machado, and I'm going to read it. To them, walker, your footsteps are the road and nothing more. Walker, there is no road. The road is made by walking. Walking, you make the road, and turning to look behind, you see the path you never again will step upon. Walker, there is no road, only foam trails on the sea.
No idea she was going to do that.
Thank you.
Now I am overwhelmed.
Hello, yes.
But well deserved.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's open it up to questions.
I represent contingent faculty at UNI. So I'm kind of curious about the, the marketing, aspect of things, because I feel like as a parent, like going through the college search process and then getting the assignment of working with contingent faculty, that I was really shocked of the deafening silence in terms of like knowing about what goes on campuses and who's teaching our children and what their working conditions are like. There's so much energy put into parent orientation and student orientation, and I'm just wondering, is there, the way that unions get like union time during certain presentations, like are there opportunities like that? They probably wouldn't be that interested, but there's probably ways to squeeze in, presentations or information and get directly to the students and parents, to get to just uncover, the big secrets that are out there. And I'm just like wondering about that. And I'm also curious, and I don't know if this already exists, but all of the organizations that, I don't think probably that we're on board with, that evaluate higher ed institutions like
Accreditors.
like US News and World Report, like whether or not, I don't remember seeing this as a criteria, but whether it's been brought to them as, or any accrediting organization, whether or not that's something that they could look at as the working conditions.
With regard to your first question, people have done some of that. People have unions on campuses. The University of Illinois Campus Labor Coalition did this for a couple of years. Demonstrations around their issues on student move-in day. Pickets, sound trucks, all that stuff. And after they got over their initial shock, the vast majority of students and their parents were very friendly. So that was direct, and that's when you got them, they're freshmen, they're moving in. Well, older students too, but especially first-year students. With regard to the rankers, people have raised the issue but haven't been able to get the issue of contingency on the radar of the rankers because they haven't figured out a way to monetize that factor. Whereas many of the other factors that they do, there's somebody making money off of that will. And accreditors, many people have raised the issue of trying to use the accreditation process as a lever. With very few exceptions, that's been a complete failure. And the large reason for that is because accreditors in the United States are non-profit private organizations as compared to every other country in the world where it's a government function to accredit universities and colleges. And they take donations. And the bad guys have bought them. There's a whole story behind that I go into more if people want to take the time. But that's the short answer of why that strategy has proven to not be useful, except in a very few specific, narrow instances. And Gary, who studies this stuff, gets actually paid to study this stuff, can correct me my overgeneralization.
No, I was actually gonna, the strike that Ann referred to, one of my doctoral students was a strike captain during that, freshman advisor. And as you said, Joe, and it is the example you gave, and the students in particular, and maybe their parents as well, but most importantly, the students are super supportive when they find out what the wages, in this case it was staff, but it's the same with contingent faculty. You write about, and I've drawn on your use of this word about the student activists, they're the connectors.
Okay.
They have the moral force to say, what? This is what you're paying contingent faculty? I'm paying $50,000, I don't know what it is now, GW, but at the time it was $50,000 a year, and they're making what? Where's the rest of the money going? So I think the moral suasion of the students as connectors and finding ways, as you're suggesting, to communicate that, it doesn't have to be formal, it just has to be people willing to talk about what their working conditions are with the people who are serving them, because the students know who's serving them. They don't know what a provost is, what an assistant to the associate to the vice provost is, they don't care. They know who's taking care of them in the residence hall, they know who's taking care of them in the classroom. Like I said this at a launch in LA. You may be adjunct in the eyes of management, and even unfortunately in the eyes of too many faculty, tenure stream faculty. You are not adjunct to your students.
Yeah.
And so they are the connectors, and really every campaign I've seen successful one connected well with the students.
Yeah.
The issue of where the money goes is a chapter in the book too,
Yeah.
and you should read that chapter. It's buried a little bit, but it's really, what's the title of that chapter?
It's by Sue Doe and Steve Schulman, and the title is, copy the book right here.
While you're looking for that, Eric, let me just quickly say, I think the student-faculty ratio is the only place where those numbers start to bubble up, and that's kind of where you have to like read behind that math a little bit, because that's the only place where that conversation could happen. So I just want to put that out there. That's because certain institutions where I have a very low, faculty to student ratio, they're often the same institutions where they have more contingent faculty. I mean, I haven't done the data on that, but that's my assumption. So there's kind of a way to read behind that a little bit. That'll be my one addition to my colleagues. Yeah.
I was just going to say that chapter that Joe referred to, it's contingency across higher education, and it's a really data-driven chapter, both data on higher ed, but also looking some of the, and where the money goes, right? That there is a surplus and that it's shifted away from the main core educational function to other areas.
You've got one behind the
question.
bar there,
Oh,
but
yeah.
you may not be able to see.
Okay. One question here, and then we'll go back here.
So the word pillaging seemed like a good one in one of the slides from Joe, and it brought to mind some of the Pew and Gallup.
Pillaging, that was Helena's word.
Sorry, some of the Pew and Gallup polls of American attitudes towards colleges and higher education. Something like nearly 60% would say something like colleges are having a negative effect on the country. Higher education is going in the wrong direction. There's more skepticism than I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that, any of you as well, because that pillaging seems in part to come from our own citizenry.
Anybody want?
We talked about it yesterday at the opening comments, that's why I'm like.
Yeah, well, they didn't talk about it.
Well, they were supposed to be.
They didn't talk about how does exploitation of employees affect the general population's view of the academy. Outrageous tuition and outrageously exploitative working conditions. The whole pitch is you get a college degree and the world is your oyster. And yet the people who are teaching you are getting poverty level wages.
And that promise is not true anymore for so
Yeah.
many students.
I think that just is a cumulatively toxic effect of a capitalistic system that people are becoming and have been for some time skeptical of. And then that coalesces with a neoconservative, fascist, white resentment backlash against, we don't care about the students you're teaching. We don't want to support you anymore. We saw it in public schools like a decade or two before higher education, and now we see it in higher education. I think it's less a skepticism about what we do than who we educate.
Let's see, we had one back here and then over.
Okay, Ken Vellante, I'm from the Oregon Education Association. I've been working with K-12 workers for about 24 years. Recently moved into higher education within Oregon Education Association. So I got to organize a bunch of folks to build up these locals. And, I'm familiar with the territory, but not familiar enough to understand or to. My question is this. I'm trying to make the analogies over to K-12, seeing some of the trends that are going on here, how you get to workers, how you sign up workers for continuing to work in multiple campuses. Is there an example or an analogy you use, sector to contingent worker, that resembles this, parallels this in history as a useful way of thinking about the contingent worker right now at college level and university level?
I'd like to answer that, and the answer is no, because the thing that distinguishes the contingent faculty from the full-time or the tenured faculty is that they are the people with the same qualifications, doing the same job, serving the same clients or customers or whatever you want to call it, and getting, like there's a stratified layer cake in higher education in the professoriate, and getting less and less and less as you go down, and then as you go down the pyramid, there's more women, people of color, etc., right? So there's no comparison anywhere, right, to a workplace where one person, because of the, niche they're in when there's no opportunity, is paid, an eighth of what another person is to do exactly the same job that reaps exactly the same profits, I'm going to say, for the employer.
But there are multiple tiers
yeah.
in some places. And the strikes, the near strike at UPS, the strike of the UAW, were both largely directed against the tiered system, and it was unfortunate that our speaker didn't mention the whole two-tier system at all, which is, I think, one of the greatest challenges facing the labor force in general, higher education in particular, and but not just faculty. I mean, it's happening among staff and in the university healthcare and all that stuff too.
Yeah, and I'll also add, again, I'm less experienced than some people on this panel, but they're within contingent labor, and I want to draw this out from what Ann was saying. Some of the 4 different categories that I think are really important are private versus public institutions, because they're covered under different legal precedent. And then also whether you're full-time or part-time. So I'm a full-time faculty member, but I'm not tenure track. The adjuncts, which are part-time, are also contingent labor. So part of the problem is that contingent labor is a very large category that can include almost anybody except people who are on a tenure track job or have tenure, okay? So that's something about history and the way that academia was created in the beginning of the 20th century. But then now contingent labor, which started as really adjuncts being one expert in this particular field who come in and do a specialized class because that was their job, but they were dropping in to do one class that they did one time, then that became economically, beneficial for the university, so that class built. But then my class of worker, which is the full-time contingent faculty, at least where I'm sitting, is that actually emerged out of a lot of the early labor activist movements of the adjunct faculty in the early 2000s. So I was hired, I unionized the adjuncts, and I had no doubt that was like, they need to unionize, because at that time we were earning $3,000 for a 4-credit class in New York City with no benefits. So that was just like, wow, and I just got my Ph.D., so that's not a lot to live on. So, but when we unionized, what they did at NYU is they created all these new positions. There were, I think, literally 16 in my department alone. Now, we're a big department. That's a lot of lines that were not tenure track, and they were full-time, and we had benefits. So our contracts were a lot better, and it was kind of nice. Like, they weren't union busting, because I was like the main rep, so like they gave me the job. And the union folks, when they got their contract, they were getting about $5,000 a class, which is better, not great. But I was then getting $35,000 to teach 4 classes, and I had some benefits. And that's the class that I'm interested in, because we're kind of the new, what I would call middle class of academia. And for me, it's kind of this larger question of like stratification in United States labor practice in general, right? You have kind of the upper class and you have the lower class. And what I'm interested in is like, how can we get a healthy middle class within academia? And I think I'm the new healthy middle class. And like, I'm now up to, I'm happy to be as transparent as possible. I'm up to 102K for my annual salary, which isn't bad. Like, I'm happy with that. I have a good contract. I get renewed every 5 years only, but I don't have tenure. So I'm actually pretty economically set. Like, I'm good. I get sabbatical, I get dental, I get retirement, and I'm still contingent faculty. So I think that's the other problem is we need to have a little bit of nuance on what it means to be contingent faculty, because some of them do pay a living wage and some of them really, really, really don't. And the thing that I got for years was like, from my colleagues and from my people I knew, because I'm an academic brat, I was raised by very high-end academics, they're like, you don't have a real job, because I didn't have tenure. And I was like, no, I have a real job. Like, I do service, I run my department, I publish, and I have a real job, but I don't have tenure. So I think that's the thing I'd add to the contingent thing is it's not all bad, and we have to be a little bit more detailed on like, is it a living wage, right? Like that in some ways is the first question for the amount of labor that you're doing, and then you get into those more base level issues of pay and service and all that good stuff. So I just want to kind of complicate that a bit.
You got another one behind the
Well, I
post
know we
over
had
there,
a
too.
question over here, and then we'll go over here next. All right, while you think about it, we'll go back here, and then.
Hey, I'm from Florida, right? So I've heard all the comments about you're from Florida. Oh man, glad you're here, I guess. But I help with the academic bargaining in the state of Florida. I think a very good, timely. This book being released and obviously available is really timely for all the things that are going on both West Coast, Northeast, everywhere. And they show me and others, how progress isn't really linear. Like, you're not gonna always keep winning and just building on wins. It's just, it's there's ups and downs. In Florida, for those who are not versed, lots of attacks on, the academic classroom, what people can do in the classroom. Students can now take action against faculty. The funding is a mess, and anti-union bills, like crazy. So one of the few of the comments that I've seen here to remind ourselves that this progress isn't linear. A couple of the comments was adjuncts really don't understand in our unions where we fit in within the political economy, but recognizing that adjunct issues are front and center more now than ever. And I'm married to a former adjunct who finally got full-time after 14 years. So this was not something, even as a labor organizer 15 years ago, was never discussed. I think that being front and center is very important, but also I'm very heartened by the metro strategy, because while unions often fight each other, we have there's going to be some inherent conflict with one another. The ability of us to work together and with student groups when possible, and with private nonprofit groups as possible, as much as we can, knowing there's going to be conflict, has demonstrated to me and others I know that are part by this stuff to keep moving in a direction that really kind of helps build us all up. And while right now, to answer the question, I think the academy is under attack, everything is under attack. This feels like incredibly demoralizing. I think we do need, and I think it's really good that this book comes out now, to recognize, yes, right now sucks, we can get ourselves out of it, it's gonna take a lot of effort, keep doing the things we're doing and do them better and smarter. That the next volume of this might have, another 5-10 years from now, a tremendous, climax. So I just wanted to kind of it's not even a question, I just wanted to kind of reframe that in a way that we can all kind of recognize where we all have come, wherever it's come.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just want to, this is the Honor Joe and Helena panel. Joe and Helen in their last book talked about channeling movement knowledge. They wanted their book, Power Despite Precarity, to channel movement knowledge. And this book that I'm coming out with, I paid homage to a dear colleague who just passed away, Louise Moll, who came up with this notion of funds of knowledge. Like all communities have bodies of knowledge, and his focus was lower income Latinx communities in the borderlands. Well, all get subjected to these deficit notions about this particular population. So what I wrote about was how there are activist funds of knowledge, and it's precisely what you're talking about. Most successful campaigns were preceded by losses, including your incredible campaign. And you mentioned when yesterday I congratulated you, oh, you won, and you said, yeah, but the people where I am don't think it was that good of a win. Like, what's really important is to keep recognizing this is more organizing that in Joe and I's lifetime has ever taken place at a level of ass kicking that is way beyond in the percentage wins in the elections and the like. And so, yes, there are these awful situations that we're in, but it's a way of just collectively recognizing and celebrating, even as you're in the fight, wins, because it's draining otherwise. And so I do think it's important for us to be sharing this knowledge, and yes, your book is really an important part of that. Our book, yes.
Yeah.
You pulled it together. You and Claire.
Yes, I do remember my question, and my name is Ellen Schrecker. I'm one of the co-editors of a book that's going to be featured in a panel tomorrow morning called The Right to Learn, Resisting the Right-Wing Attack on Academic Freedom. And of course, Helena has her piece in here. She and Joe split it up. They could have been in both. She and Joe had a chapter in our book. And what I wanted, the question that I forgot before, was simply that we're dealing with a problem that's so broad. You know, you gave it the name, which was a dirty word in the 1950s when I was growing up. I mean, in one of my earlier books, I talked about a faculty member during the McCarthy period who never used the word capitalism in his class. He always used industrialization. Well, not quite the same thing. But anyhow, what we're looking at is the fact that this is a society of enormous and growing inequality. And how do we deal with it? And what the masters of the universe figured out was, let's divert people's attention. You know, redistribution, they might ask us to pay taxes. But, you know, it's an individual problem, right? You work hard, you keep your clothes clean, whatever, and you go to get yourself a bachelor's degree, and, you know, all is bread and roses. But that was probably, at some point, a whole bunch of people thought, hey, you know, we're going to give them something, right? We're going to give them higher education, and then they'll be able to have a secure middle-class existence, just as their parents did working in the automobile factories before all the jobs went to Japan and Mexico. So I think we have to sort of somehow get it across. This is why higher education, I mean, I started asking myself, why is higher education on the front pages of the New York Times all the time? I'm sort of thinking, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this one? But it's because there are forces that want to divert people from real problems. And I think that's a very important way why we're being attacked as a surrogate for the boss. It's as simple as that.
The epistemology of ignorance is one of one of her writers, Valerie
Valerie
Johnson.
Johnson, my co-editor, along.
Epistemology of Ignorance. One of the writers in Ellen's book, Valerie Johnson, has a chapter about the deliberate creation of a curriculum of disciplined ignorance that keeps people from being able to figure out what's going on in the world around them. Yeah, the most obvious example is taking away history. And you have to actually ask if there are other examples that you can look for to understand how to pull all of these different threads of contingency together. And, you know, what we need is a brainstorming session with some labor historians. Like, you know.
Any comments on those points?
Yes.
All right. Other questions? We have about 10 minutes left, so maybe we can take one or two more questions, and then I'll give the panelists a chance to say some final words if they would like. Yeah, but.
I used to work
And
with.
if you could introduce
Oh,
yourself.
I apologize. Sorry. I'm Joy Blanchard. I'm a faculty member at Louisiana State University. And you mentioned that you are currently working with RAs, which I love that movement is occurring. I worked in housing, and they definitely need some support. So I'm just curious, what are some? Well, I can imagine the issues that you are facing as far as the pushback, but tell us more about the movement to unionize the RAs and what are they fighting for?
So I would say and I know there's a number of unionized RAs in the country already, and you know, a few years ago we had an effort at GW that didn't come to anything, but that was the effort that made the NLRB say that yes, they were employees. It's the same as any employee, right? It's working up too many hours, more hours than you're told, you know, bullying from supervisors, we talked about that earlier. You know, as a wageless worker, do you negotiate a wage? Maybe, but maybe it's the more better stipend, and just a way to complain when they're, you know, abused or disabused or just not treated well. The voice at work is every worker needs it, even if you don't have a wage. Renewals, I think that was another one, right? Not getting arbitrarily used in your position because then you don't have any housing, right? So just cause.
I also think one of the reasons it's rising so much now is that the pressure on those people post-COVID, with all the damages that COVID and the distance education and all that did, that, you know, the psychological problems and social psychological that students are having, both K-12 and higher ed, is much greater. And the RAs are the first person that they got to deal with. And, you know, they're the mass of, you know, barefoot counselors that are facing that on the front lines in completely inadequate conditions for them and for the people they're trying. Another example of our working conditions are their learning, or in this case, living conditions. You know, and that's true of service workers generally, all of us involved in various levels of social reproduction, whether we're getting paid cash money or not. You know, whether we're working in the home or in a more collectivized situation. You know, and I think that idea needs to get publicized more, and certainly the idea of social reproduction and the fact that these are exploited workers who are part of the working class. And need to be seen that way and organized that way into a force strong enough to change the world.
So I'll just say, so we're in the same field, Joy. It's a gendered workforce, student affairs. It's student support professionals are the only professional workforce on college campuses where the majority of folks identify as women. They're the most diverse in terms of ethnicity and they're the most diverse in terms of gender orientation. And that factors into what you were saying about caring work. So they're there 24/7. They're basically on call. Oh, great. We get to live here for free. No, you don't. You're on call 24/7. And so I think we always want to remember capitalism is a patriarchal project, as you nicely articulated in your piece and in this session, Gwendolyn. It's a racial project. Capitalism deeply is a racial project from its inception. And dividing and conquering workers as part of a racial project is part of the game. We saw it at Amazon in the South. We saw it in the origins of capitalism. And it's a colonial project. So the treatment of international workers is front, and that is what capitalism is. And I think we always want to not lose sight of that. That's where I think the grad employees and the postdocs in particular have more front and center those issues of it's a racial project, it's a patriarchal project, and it's a colonial project. I think that's what we all should be recognizing and participating in it, and that's the continuity with schools. This is a concerted attack on higher education, just like we've seen for 40 years on public schools. You attack it, you disinvest in it, you create neoliberal alternatives to it for the wealthier, and then you kill it. That is the game. And it's because who's getting educated in the schools? And now who's getting educated in higher education? Those things are connected. So it is a class thing, but you mentioned intersectionality. It is class and all these other things intersecting with it.
We're going to squeeze in one more question.
Yes, I'm Susan D. Ramo from the City College of New York. And I've been a union activist on the executive committee for 20 years. But I'd like to congratulate the panel, because I want to say at the City University of New York, we have gained, a few years ago, adjuncts were only getting $3,000 a course. Now it's $6,000 a course. We have 3-year contracts, and that's only because we've all been fighting together. But a lot of times I get discouraged, but I'm still teaching. I've been an adjunct 40 years, and I'm still at the same campus. I'm at 2 campuses actually, and so thank you all for continuing the struggle, as I am too. That's all I wanted to say.
Wow. And unless anybody has a final word, I think that's a good note on which to close. Thank you very much. And thanks to the panelists.